He says this. He says, T.S. Eliot perceptively described today's religious crisis as that of a widespread emotional incapacity. If we are to believe this diagnosis, the problem for faith today is not primarily that of believing more or believing less with regard to particular doctrines. Rather, it is the inability of so many of our contemporaries to be profoundly moved in the face of God, in the face of his creation and of other human beings.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Logos Podcast. This is Deacon Max.
This is Deacon Joey.
Boy, it's been a while.
We're back, though.
We're patras.
Well, you're back. I've been here.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to come back when I stay here. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. But we back. We are back, and we have an episode for you today. We're going to be talking about. Actually, Deacon Joey, why don't you just introduce us?
I feel like you're patronizing me right now.
I'm always patronizing you, so you would be correct.
Well, considering it was my idea to do this episode, I'll tell our listeners that we're going to do this episode on Pope Francis's recent letter on the importance of literature in human life, really. I mean, we'll get into it, but it's a very beautiful document. I'm really excited to talk about it. Some deep stuff in there coming from our Holy Father. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But before we do, welcome to Logos Podcast.
What's up?
We're glad you're here. Just a huge shout out, first of all, before we begin, to all of the people who have responded to this capital campaign that Deacon Max and I have started over the past couple of weeks as we look ahead to this new year of Logos Podcast. Thank you so much for all the support that we've gotten. It's truly, we're so grateful. It's enabling us to do what we are hoping to do this year. So know that we're praying for all of our patrons specifically, but also all of our listeners.
Hey, Joe, could you please turn off your sound notifications? That'd be nice. You know what I mean?
I'm trying to figure out who the heck is texting me.
I think it's actually one of our professors telling us that we're going to have class outside in the next hour and a half.
Oh, heck.
I know. It's so beautiful outside. Talking about outside, I don't know where I was going to go with that.
Well, we have to catch up.
We do.
How
have to
are
catch
you?
up
How's your life?
Well, let's see.
So Deacon Max and I have been apart for the whole summer. Our last couple episodes, it's been just me talking,
And that sucked, huh? Do you agree? I mean, I tried to listen to them. Boy, I was moved. I was moved all right. Moved to anger and resentment.
That's weird. That's actually why I wrote and delivered those talks, just to get under your skin.
No. Yes, we have been apart. A lot has happened, man. I mean, we've kept you updated throughout the summer.
Yeah.
We haven't had...
we haven't been together in the studio doing an episode in
a while.
Well, a long time.
We also haven't had a camera on us in a while. We've been doing strictly audio maybe the last close to a month now. So we're back.
Week. Yeah.
We've been doing a lot.
We're 3 weeks into our new school year, our final seminary school year.
Dude, that's... I was thinking about yesterday. You've been here for a long time.
Yes, I have.
And I was praying for you.
Thank you.
I was like, that's a long time, dude.
Yeah.
And you're a patient man, and you're ending as a good trooper would, with your head held high. You're ready for war.
Ready for battle.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, this is my 8th year of seminary formation, which is a lot of years. This is your what, 6th, 7th year?
This is my 6th year.
6th year.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, so if you can see a gap between me and Deacon Max, it's those extra 2 years, that I've had.
Yeah.
Just setting me over and over.
Hey, dude, I feel like you're patronizing me, dude.
We have not a ton of classes this semester.
No, actually,
it's
actually
4
crazy.
classes, which is really nice.
I don't think I've had this amount of classes since high school.
Yeah, it's really nice, which is mostly so that we can we're in parish ministry now as we're in the middle of the school year. So, of course, when we're taking advantage of this light academic load so that we can just play Xbox and eat Cheetos all day.
That's what I'm doing. Hot Cheetos specifically, but yes.
And yeah, life is good. It's good to be back with the guys. What's been the best part of the year so far?
I think the time away from classes that we've had.
Yeah.
Not because I don't like studying and not because I don't like the material we've been studying, but I think just it's nice to have the ability to leisure when we want, and we can actually plan it out in our day. This is obviously a form of that, podcasting. I enjoy it. We enjoy it. So that's an expression of that. But just generally kind of we're the arbiters of our schedule in a certain way, whereas before we were not as much. And so that's I've really enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah.
It's even enabled me to like go out with guys that are not in our class.
Right.
Go out to coffee or lunch or dinner or whatever.
Yeah. Spending more time with the
yeah,
guys.
that's right.
Enjoy. Yeah, that's what I am trying to enjoy the time with my brother seminarians as much as I can for this last year, because I'm not going to have that, after this year's over. So yeah.
How about you, man?
Let's see. Well, actually, we just had a 40 hours Eucharistic retreat this past weekend, which was wonderful. We had Auxiliary Bishop Bob Lombardo, who's a Franciscan friar, the Renewal.
That's right.
He came in and he preached the conferences. We had 40 hours of continuous Eucharistic adoration. Not me personally. Max was on his knees for all 40 hours. But it was beautiful. And then we finished with a procession, and so that was a great. We do that at the beginning of every academic year, a couple weeks in, but that was really it's good to set the tone for the year. Yeah. With what's most essential. So
amen to that.
Okay, I'm the one who decided to talk about this document that Pope Francis wrote, but in your mind, why did you agree to talk about this document when I proposed it?
I have no idea. To be honest with you. You just literally sent it to me like, yo, we should do that. I said, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. No. So at first, I mean, actually, this is kind of funny. When you sent me this document, in my head, I read a lot. In my head, I love literature and reading. But I have to be honest with you guys. I used to absolutely hate reading and studying and anything that had to do with truth in general. And I think that's one of the reasons I was actually motivated to do it, because, going on now my 6th year of formation, what Pope Francis wrote in this document was really speaking to me as I was praying with it. I was like, I've come to believe this to be true, but because I've experienced the word. Because I've experienced the word. So I think at first it was like
the Logos one might
exactly.
say.
And at first it was just like, all right, yeah, this sounds like an interesting thing to talk about. It's very much our MO. But then I was like, you know what, Lord, actually, I want to talk about this, and I want to talk about the power of it. So I think that's part of it. And I also think it stands as this document, or this letter stands as an antithesis to what we've called before, what other authors have called kind of a technocratic culture.
Yeah.
Kind of a culture that emphasizes technology, work, efficiency, productivity, which we've been kind of heavy critics of it to some extent. But literature kind of challenges that narrative of a society, of a people. And it's certainly challenged my own life.
Yeah, even the act of sitting down to read literature is kind of a protest against that constant buzz of productivity that's forced upon us by the culture in which we live. So.
Yeah, and so this letter kind of reinforces that narrative that reading is important, literature is important, that Jesus Christ, the Logos, found in the word that the words are speaking, is important.
Yeah.
So there's a couple motivations.
And those are exactly some of the ideas that I had in mind when I heard about this letter, and I actually proposed it to you as an episode idea before I had read the letter. I hadn't read the letter yet, but I just heard. I heard that it was good.
Oh, nice.
And Pope Francis just takes a lot of criticism from so many people, but he's actually written he's written a lot of really beautiful documents, and this is one of them. And I just want to share that with people. So, Deacon Max and I are going to draw out some of the major themes, some of our favorite points of this document. It's a short document. Okay, some of his encyclicals are like 200 pages. So you're probably not ever going to read those. Maybe you will. If you do, that's awesome. But
I'll be honest with you. I've tried to read some of them. I'm like, this is a lot.
It's long. But this one is not. This one's like 7 pages or something like that. I read it on my iPad, so I don't know. But it's short. So you could read it, and you'll be able to get more out of it than we're going to be able to extract from it in this episode. But that's one of the big reasons that I want to talk about it too. Just listening to the voice of our Holy Father when it's giving us truth and beauty to meditate upon, I think is really important for us to do. Yeah, as Catholics.
If you've noticed during my intercessions, at Mass, I've been emphasizing, for our Holy Father Pope Francis, the Church and the faithful and the priest may look to him as a source of union. I think it's very important. I think it's something I oftentimes undermine. Like what makes us Catholic actually happens to be him.
Right.
Right. His chair.
He's the sacrament of unity for the whole church.
Yeah. So I think, this document, as you were pointing out, I hope is a kind of an oblation to him in a certain way. So
an oblation. We're not offering sacrifice to Pope Francis, but we're.
No, we definitely are. And there's a goat coming in here in about, oh, there he is. There he is.
So many Protestants right now are just ripping their hair out like, these Catholics are idolaters. Okay.
Only a little bit. Only when I sin.
Yeah, that's true. So that's why we want to talk about it. So now let's talk about it.
Yeah, man. Okay, a little bit of context of the letter, though.
Yeah. Let's
brief context. All right. So it was actually written relatively recently, like
Yeah.
July 17th of this year. Recently, it was initially drafted to be addressed to the formation of seminarians studying for the priesthood. However, Pope Francis was talking about how as he drafted the letter, he was like, you know what, this actually applies to everybody.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think it does. I mean, he does have some direct, points towards priestly formation, but it actually seems to be generally directed towards all. And I think that's where we hope to draw on a little
Which
bit.
is an important point too, because, in the seminary, we have this really beautiful system of formation where we try to grow as human beings. We try to grow in our spiritual life, our intellectual life, and then our pastoral capacities. But really, these things are not just for seminarians. Like, we're going to actually have a psychologist on in a couple weeks, I think, whose whole MO is about exposing the faithful, the lay faithful, to the riches of the formation that takes place in seminaries. And I think Pope Francis is kind of operating on that wavelength there. He's like, okay, this is not just needed for priests, this is needed for human beings, right?
And in fact, a little history here, like formation in seminaries were the foundation for what became the universities. With that whole intention in mind. Like, it was the formation of the person. Still in seminary, for example, we have what we call formators, right? They're not called teachers or educators. They're called formators. They're forming the person. And so there is some of that kind of reality of and we saw it with kind of the evangelical efforts of maybe the Jesuits, in South America, Central America, Latin America. It was like enculture people by forming them.
Yeah.
So anyways, that was some of that.
Yeah. Okay. So, Pope Francis, he gets into this letter and at the beginning, he makes a couple points just about reading in general that we wanted to draw out, right? And reading in general, he says, is good.
That's good. I'm glad he says that. What if he's like, reading, don't do that. Not good. Straight to jail right away.
But, I read that and I was like, he's so right, because obviously Deacon Max and I were full-time students. We like to read. We're kind of nerds. But I think that, like, for example, if I'm ever talking to somebody who's like total pagan, like doesn't know religion, isn't religious, or like a nominal Christian who doesn't really practice their faith that much, and they're immersed in what the rest of our culture is immersed in: Netflix, TikTok, Instagram, all these things, these visual forms of media. If I can dialogue with them and get them to read a book, it doesn't have to be a Christian book. It can be any book. I think that's a small victory in bringing them towards the Lord.
That's a great insight,
right? Because there's something about reading a book, and Pope Francis makes this point. It's like it demands that we access our own interior life in a way that when I'm watching a movie, I can just kind of passively veg out and receive it and not have to enter into my own heart in any sort of way. But when I'm reading a book, I really have to. I'm using my imagination. I'm using my memory. I'm engaging with the text in a more active way, and I think it's like a step on the road towards prayer.
Yeah, and in fact, that's so like it fosters this interiority. This, like you said, kind of enlivens the imagination. And in fact, that I was going to make the point that Jesuit spirituality kind of emphasizes that. The enlivening of the imagination through Lectio Divina. Right? So you walk down the scriptures and you kind of place yourself in it. What's going on around? What are you smelling? What are you seeing? Who are you talking to? Who's there? Who's not there in the biblical narrative? And I think reading, fosters that in us. It certainly has in me. But as you're pointing out, so many people, just lie about their summer reading projects, for example. I try to get a high schooler, who wants to rip jewel pods and watch Theo Von on YouTube all day, which is partly my lifestyle. But, trying to get them.
It's not Deacon Max's lifestyle.
It's
not
the
jewel pods.
Not the jewel pods. Definitely not the jewel pods. Anyways, what I was going to say is try to get them to read a book. Try. They tried with me for years.
Yeah.
And I don't think I did maybe one summer, but because my dad forced me to read that book, Hamlet.
No, and I had an experience in high school. So when I was in middle school, we did AR. Did you guys do AR?
Oh yeah, dude. Pizza parties?
Yeah, you had to take a little AR test every time. So I read all the time. When I was in middle school, I read.
Oh, you were such a nerd, dude. I would have hated your kind of guy, dude.
Let me finish. Dude.
I tried to sneak into that party because I lied about my reading projects, but you actually read the stuff.
Come on. But then I got into high school and I just became convinced that I was too cool for books. Books. I'm not going to do that. So I didn't read a book, even though they were assigned in class. I didn't read a book from
last year,
freshman year till junior year, legit.
Oh, wow.
Like I spark noted books and just like got by, reading as little as I possibly could.
Sure.
But then junior year, I had this, I know it was a movement of the Holy Spirit where I wasn't necessarily getting, I was kind of away from the faith a little bit, not super active in prayer, or I wasn't close to the Lord, but there was a movement within me that was like, I want to start taking my studies seriously. I want to start like reading things. And I remember we had to read The Invisible Man for our summer assignment. And I sat down to read this book, and my ability to read, because I hadn't done it in like 3 years, was so poor that it took me so long and I comprehended so little of it. I read like 500 pages of this book and then got to school the first week and couldn't answer a simple question about one of the most central themes in the book.
Yeah.
Because my comprehension was just so bad. So that's when I realized, like, oh my gosh, I've lost this ability and I need to try to gain it again. So thanks be to God. Next year, I'm hoping to finally be able to read again.
I'm also convinced that like many people don't like reading because we expose them to such poor literature.
Yeah.
Or we do such a poor job of ourselves as teachers, as adults, emphasizing the profound nature of literature, of reading in general, the power of it. Because we live in a culture that doesn't take it serious. We live in a culture that, can't slow down, loves noise, loves efficiency, productivity, and a book makes you slow down. But I don't want to slow down. I want to be on my phone all day.
Right.
I want to go do this. I want to go do that. Reading, as going to that point, like in general, fosters interiority, but also forces you to slow down a little bit.
Yep.
As I was talking and choking on my own words, it forced me to slow down as I was reading the text on the outline. You feel me?
That's like just prime example right there, baby.
I am a prime example of humanity, really. Deacon Joey.
The paragon of animals. So Pope Francis, he defines literature in a weird way. In a very interesting way, I think, at the beginning of the document. I mean, why are you looking at me like I'm weird, dude?
Well, you said we were talking about how we're here to talk up Pope Francis.
Well, no.
And then you say
I guess
that he defined literature in a weird way.
I mean, the word weird, I was that was not a shot at Pope Francis. It's a definition of literature that I would not have anticipated. Okay. And this is what it says. Yeah, okay.
Fair enough.
He says literature is life conscious of itself, that reaches its full self-expression through the use of all the conceptual resources of language. Life conscious of itself. That's a little weird, but it's like profound. Yeah. Not weird in a bad way. It's just I had never.
It's deeply spiritual.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it is, and as you're pointing out, I think I would agree. It's very different than what like the secular world would propose to us that literature is. Here it really requires a dimension of contemplation. Yeah. It's kind of an organized patterns of language so as to bring us into a deeper subjectivity.
Yeah, and it's something that, of course, only human beings, as far as we know, in this cosmos can. It's an activity that only they can engage in, right? Because the animals, they don't have this. If they have some level of consciousness, and they don't have this capacity for self-reflection and like imagination and creativity that we do, and so, it's an amazing thing that a human being can sit down and create a story or
communicate at all.
Yeah, well, yeah, certainly. And write a poem. So that's how he defines literature, life conscious of itself.
He also has another phrase where he talks about literature. He says it engages our concrete existence with its innate tensions and desires and meaningful experiences. Yeah. Right. So literature carries with it kind of this pulse of humanity, and helps us enter into them. There's some beautiful aspects of literature that he draws out that kind of hit this point all the more. Yeah. That we
so he has four. We wanted to pull out four main themes, right? Yeah. Four main themes from this document that we saw that, kind of points that Pope Francis is making. Again, you should go read the document yourself because it's really good. It's just so beautiful. But the first point he makes is that reading good literature, it shapes our own hearts and it helps us to become more human. Yeah. Do you want to read that quote from Pope Francis from the document?
Yeah, sure. So he says that novels unleash in us the space of an hour, all the possible joys and misfortunes that in life it would take us entire years to know, even slightly, and of which the most intense would never be revealed to us because the slowness with which they occur prevents us from perceiving them. Right, so the idea that like reading helps us understand realities that we would not have otherwise had the time to understand.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It prepares our hearts to experience them when they come, as they're coming, rather than having to wait a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries, which is where we get some of these texts.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we just read this and are able to understand better. It really is kind of wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you mentioned wisdom. I'm thinking right now of the virtue of prudence, right? When St. Thomas Aquinas talks about the virtue of prudence, which he says is the queen of all the moral virtues, because it's the virtue that allows us to know how to act, how to pursue the good here and now in this particular circumstance. He says the only way to acquire virtue is either by seeking advice from your elders, but ultimately the most powerful way to acquire the virtue of prudence is by experience. By lived experience. So the only way I can become a prudent man is usually by failing.
Yeah.
And by learning from my mistakes and saying, oh crap, I'm not going to do that next time. Now, of course, you can also learn by your successes. If I make a correct decision in a particular circumstance, I can, kind of file that away and know to do a similar thing in the future. But, the problem with experience is that it takes a while to obtain. Right? Like, this is why our elders are usually wise and we young people are not, because we haven't had all this life experience. But literature, Pope Francis is saying, actually allows us to have all of these experiences that we, in our current age haven't yet had. We can, and therefore acquire kind of in and through them the virtue of prudence. It's kind of like watching film as an athlete. Yeah. Right? Like, if I'm trying to prepare for a game and I'm watching game film from the last game, I'm getting the mental reps that allow me to know what to do in the future if an analogous situation arises. Literature's kind of like that, except not for a sport, but for the mystery of human life in general. So I think that's really cool. I think that's a really good reason to read literature. It can help us become wise and develop the virtue of prudence.
Well, which carries us to our second quote about this topic, because as you mentioned, one of the other ways we can learn virtue is by relying on others, on the experience of others, learning from others. Mm-hmm. So I want to read this second quote. It reads, "In reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, but it is still I who see. Here, as in worship, in love, in moral action, and in knowing, I transcend myself and am never more myself than when I do." So that idea, right? So like, what does literature help us to? Keeps us in touch with the experiences of others.
Yeah, that too. Mm-hmm.
Right? Like this idea that like I'm limited. If I'm my only resource for wisdom, for knowledge, for how to navigate the reality, it turns out to be a very limited scope, very limited view of reality. So literature kind of gives us the tradition, the wisdom tradition of others, which is why by the way in the church we have what we call kind of a patrimonial wisdom tradition, right? We go back to the ancients, the Romans, the Greeks, Jewish literature, right? We go back to the church fathers, the Ressourcement, to the Second Vatican Council, this whole idea of like calling us back, right, to the experiences of others so that we don't have to navigate this difficult reality as it is through our limited experiences, but rather confiding in those experiences of others to teach us what life is. Because as he says here as in worship, as in love, as in moral action, as in knowing, I transcend myself. It's not always abundantly clear as to what it means to worship God, what it means to love, as to what it means to choose a proper moral action, right? Which is why we have something like, well, in the Catholic sense, natural law. So we rely on creation, on nature to help us see how things interact properly, how we interact with the world. But also we rely on divine law. God reveals something to us about how humanity is supposed to work, live. And so literature, I think, opens us up to the other.
I think so, which actually leads us right into our next point. The second reason that Pope Francis recommends that all of us read more literature, and I think this is perhaps the most important point. I think this is why ultimately he wrote the document, because he's the Pope, right? He's concerned with preaching the gospel. He's concerned with evangelizing. He's concerned with bringing other people to Jesus Christ. And
I want to talk about this real quick, Joey, this point you're making, because earlier today in Mass, I was like, why is it that we should care what the Pope has to say generally? And I know it sounds kind of bold because I'm a seminarian deacon, soon to be a priest, but like, why should we care what Rome has to say, what the Pope has to say? Well, because for many years of Western history, several hundred centuries, Rome spoke for all of culture. People looked to Rome for what culture and society was supposed to be shaped after, right? And for many of those years, the Roman pontiff held the throne, the chair that spoke for kind of the pivoting way, the method, the shape, the heart of culture. He spoke to its heart, to its needs, and also to its goodness. And so the papacy, the popes, will write these documents not just because they're sitting from the throne trying to kind of dictate decrees of what's good and what's bad, or what's the sins of the world. They're sitting there to try to kind of help pivot humanity as to where he is or not to go.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, like you said, carry out the evangelical mission of the church.
That's a good point. I would just respond to that by saying we shouldn't just listen to the Pope because historically people listen to the Pope.
Correct.
Right. The reason that historically people listen to the Pope and that we should continue to listen to the Pope is because he is the vicar of Christ on earth. Correct. Right? And it's a divinely instituted office. But yes, exactly what you're saying. The Pope is concerned with shaping the hearts of humanity, slowly leading them towards the gospel. And he's telling us in this document that it's beneficial for all of us to read more literature. And the second reason that he gives for this is because if we are going to preach the gospel to human beings, we need to know those human beings. We need to know their hearts so that we can preach the gospel in a way that's attractive to them. And so what Pope Francis says is reading literature does precisely that. It helps us know the heart of man. It helps us know our own hearts. That was the first point. But it helps us know the heart of man so that we can effectively preach the gospel to him.
Correct. He has this quote, which I think is very powerful. He says, for Christians, nothing that is human is indifferent, right? So life of faith doesn't navigate or work or talk or read the world with this attitude of indifference.
No.
The eyes of faith actually open us up to see that the world is purposeful.
And that humanity in particular. And why is that? Well, it's because God became man.
Right. God became man and viewed it with just a beautiful dignity that we're called to enter into, as you were talking about. On the one hand, to get to know our own heart, but to get to know the heart of man so as to prepare it for the word.
Yes. Right. And there's one kind of strategy for preaching the gospel that I don't recommend that is pretty much, I'm going to come in with the gospel truth and impose it upon you and just tell you what you should believe and that this is true and you should become Christian now. Right. And no one is going to respond to that.
You know why? I have a theory.
All right. Tell me your theory.
That truth doesn't work in the gospel does not work in that fashion because it undermines the nature of truth. The nature of truth necessarily involves the subject, because truth is a person, and so it involves our personhood to be able to understand it in the way that we know how. In the tradition, we have what's called divine pedagogy, right? Like our Lord came down at the time where man was ready, more or less. He had prepared throughout salvation history a group of people. Then it expanded, and he entered history, right? Mm-hmm. He didn't just after the fall, clear the ground, and send everybody to heaven. That's not what happened. What he did is he tried to teach us. He walks with us, and then he became one of us to help us enter into that salvific act.
Yeah, and when he came, he didn't just force the gospel down our throats.
He also didn't come as a king.
He invited us to accept it freely. Correct. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. If you want to preach the gospel, you don't impose it on others. You have to invite them to accept it freely. And before you do that, you have to know them. Yeah. And like Jesus came to know us, he became like us in all things but sin, right? Mm-hmm. He experienced every aspect of our human experience. We were reading about the Jesuit missionaries today in our American church history class, how they came over and literally, before they even preached the gospel, they just started living the life of these, they were Indians living in Canada at the time, right? In Quebec. Mm-hmm. And that's what they did first. They were just, can we just share life with you? Can we just get to know you? Can we just listen to you and discover who you are and see the beauty of your culture?
How do you worship God exactly?
Right. They just get to know them. And then only after they've established that relationship, they preach the gospel. Well, Pope Francis is saying we need to preach the gospel. That needs to be our strategy. And what literature does is it helps us to listen to the heart of man. Mm. It helps us to grow in empathy for the people by whom we're surrounded. It helps us to know the deep questions that man is wrestling with so that we can respond to those questions in love. Mm. So many of us are crippled in our ability to really listen to another and really to empathize with another. It's because in this climate that we live in right now in our political system, especially in America, it's just so divisive. People just talk past each other. They don't listen. But Pope Francis is saying, no, reading literature it's not just life experience for you. It's also practice, like concrete practice of listening to the heart and the voice of another.
Yeah. And that's the thing, Jay, it's been my own personal experience too. Like when I read, it forces me to almost enter into dialogue with the author.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And I'm oftentimes in dialogue with myself, which means that I'm sane for one, but it also just means that like it can be very easy to fall into the kind of the all-encompassing self.
Yes.
But literature kind of forces us to listen.
Breaks you out of that.
Right. And that's actually one of the things that Pope Francis draws on regarding kind of a biblical example.
Yeah, he points
he points to St. Paul, right, in the Areopagus.
Lest we think Pope Francis is just making this up out of on his papal throne.
Turns out,
no, he's pointing to Scripture.
Yeah, and we mentioned earlier. Jesus Christ Himself, the Logos, the Word became flesh. That's kind of we could say it's the pedagogical pattern of how we are to reach man's heart. How do we do so? By becoming one with man.
Yes,
you know. But he points to St. Paul in the Areopagus, and he said, what did Paul do? He understood that literature brings to light the abysses within the human heart, within the human person, while revelation and then theology take over to show how Christ enters these depths and illumines them. In the face of these depths, literature is thus a path to helping shepherds of souls enter into a fruitful dialogue with the culture of their time. So here he seems to be talking to kind of, priests, but I think this applies to anybody. Like you have to work your way into the heart.
Yeah, and for context, I guess we should have put this on our outline and then read it before this. But he's talking about Acts chapter 17 when St. Paul goes to the Areopagus in Athens and he's dialoguing with some of the people in the town square. And what St. Paul does is they have all these shrines, and there's one shrine to an unknown God, right? And St. Paul says, this God whom you're worshiping, the unknown God, is actually possibly the God, the creator of the universe. And he's trying to draw this out of them, trying to point the seeds of the gospel that are already planted within their hearts because they're human beings to the truth. And then what he does is he quotes a poet.
Yep.
He says, as your own poets have said, in him we live and move and have our being. Yep. Right? And so what Pope Francis is doing is like, St. Paul read literature. St. Paul read literature, and what that allowed him to do was preach the gospel to the hearts of these men because he knew what questions they were wrestling with.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason, it's another very powerful reason to read literature. It's because it puts us in touch with man.
There was a point, I can't remember what class we talked about this. It may have been our new evangelization class or evangelization class. But this idea that in pagan cultures, let's say Greek cultures, the way that you taught people, and for much of human history, this was the case actually, the way you taught people is actually by telling them a story.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You didn't go in there and have this kind of scholastic, let's say, arrangement of ideas that came about in the 15th, 16th century. That came in later, and that's been very helpful and has had its own fruits. But for much of human history, it was you write a story, you write a poem, you sing a song, and you teach a life lesson.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's patterned after what our Lord did in the scriptures too, when he spoke in parables.
Yep.
Right. How did he do it? He didn't go into this thesis or this defense of an idea. Oftentimes he did it by way of a story, he told stories. And this is one of the things that I see somebody like Jonathan Paggio trying to reclaim, somebody like Jordan Peterson reclaiming too. This idea of the narrative of reality rather than a scientific worldview. What is the drama, Hans von Balthasar, the theodrama of reality?
Yeah.
Where's God in this? Where's the logos in this thing we're calling reality unfolding before us? Because that's the method, it seems to me, that has been for the vast majority of human history and the own kind of evangelical method our Lord used in the gospel.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And then I guess I want to just draw this point. So still in the second major theme from the document, that reading literature helps us to know the heart of man, which helps us to then evangelize man. Pope Francis in the document quotes T.S. Eliot, who is a famous Catholic poet, and I think he wrote novels too.
He did. Mm-hmm.
He says this. He says, T.S. Eliot perceptively described today's religious crisis as that of a widespread emotional incapacity. If we are to believe this diagnosis, the problem for faith today is not primarily that of believing more or believing less with regard to particular doctrines. Rather, it is the inability of so many of our contemporaries to be profoundly moved in the face of God, in the face of his creation and of other human beings.
I think this quote, Joey, like if I had to summarize my spirituality, this quote encompasses that. Like I truly believe, kind of what T.S. Eliot's bringing out here, that the crisis of faith in man's heart today is not because he has chosen intentionally against the truths of the faith.
It's like I read the catechism and I think that's dumb.
I hate this. This guy sucked preaching and that's just, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
That may be so. But I think at the heart of the issue or the heart of the matter is that said person lacks wonder.
Yeah.
Lacks an open heart to something beyond the view of what they hold truth to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They've locked themselves to a sort of vision in the name of being open-minded.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. That's the irony.
Like that's a great irony here. And that's one of the great ironies I know I fell into my deep sin. Like I know what I'm about. I don't need that. I don't need you priest, you whatever, you
right.
church. I got this figured out. I'm
right.
watching enough YouTube TED Talks. I think I got it handled. Okay. I've had a few glasses of wines with my friends. We've talked about life and stuff, you know?
We figured it out.
We figured it out. But like truly people lack faith because, and I think it's fair to say, you may agree with this, Deacon Joey, as churchmen, we've done a poor job of enkindling that fire of wonder within our people.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Like, and I think that's one of the reasons why our project has been somewhat successful.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually not doing anything revolutionary or crazy. We're kind of just exposing you in enthusiasm and joy in our own youth, the truths of the faith.
Which we're amazed at.
And it changed our lives, which is why we want to give it to you guys. Yeah. But because we believe in its power.
Mm-hmm.
We believe that that the Logos does transform and awaken the dimension of the vertical, of the transcendent, of the spiritual, of the divine, that he does open that dimension within us if we believe.
Yeah.
Right? If the grace of faith opens and spurs us onward. And I think this diagnosis that Pope Francis is drawing on, that T.S. Eliot pointed out, is spot on.
Emotional incapacity. That's the problem with so many people today. And what he's saying is literature can maybe unlock that and therefore open people's hearts to the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it is also interesting that, and then we can move on here, Joe, but it's interesting to me that how we have this kind of psychotherapeutic culture in a lot of ways, you know, to put us in tune with our emotions. Mm-hmm. But I think oftentimes we also just don't even know what it means to feel emotions orderly anymore.
Right. Or at all. I mean, people I think are just numb. They're walking zombies. Mm. So read literature. That'll help. Okay, what's the third big point that Pope Francis makes about the importance of reading literature?
This is a big one. So he says that reading literature helps us to know the humanity of Jesus Christ.
Which, this is a point we've already kind of made, but this is, Pope Paul VI, Pope St. Paul VI, I should say, in one of his first encyclicals as Pope, he was elected Pope during the Second Vatican Council when the Church is wrestling with how to interact with the modern world, right? And he releases this encyclical called Ecclesiam Suam, and he's talking about evangelizing the different levels of society, those who are Christian but fallen away, those who are non-Christian, those who are atheists, essentially. And, the question had become, the world had become anti-Christian after the French Revolution, and the church was trying to respond to this, and society was becoming more secular. And so there was a temptation within the church to say, we need to flee from the world, like everything in the world is bad and contrary to the gospel, and we need to kind of hunker down and protect ourselves and shield ourselves from everything that's human. And
which has always been a temptation in the history of the church.
You're right.
Of any person.
You're right. And we just need to focus on divine things. Yeah. But Pope St. Paul VI said in that document, it's just so amazing. He said, we've always known that learning more about God helps us to know more about man. Yeah. That's the basis of theological anthropology. But what he said is the converse is also true. Learning more about man helps us to know more about God.
That's right.
Because God became a man. So when we learn the heart of humanity, as was the second point of this document that we drew out, you are de facto drawing closer to the heart of Jesus, because he was the most perfect human heart that experienced everything that a human heart can possibly experience at a level that we're not even capable of fathoming, right? And so when we're drawing close to the heart of man, we are drawing close to the Lord. And obviously you'd have to qualify that. It's like, okay, if you go out to the bar and sin and you're like, oh, I'm drawn close to man, so I'm drawn close to the Lord. It's like, no, okay, that you're in that sense, you're turning away from the Lord. But you're
turning away from yourself too.
You're turning away from yourself. But even the person who's like sinning in the bar, his heart is oriented towards Jesus Christ. And if you get to know his heart, it will lead you ultimately towards Jesus Christ. So do you want to read this quote from Pope Francis from the document regarding this point?
Yeah, so he says that the urgent task of proclaiming the gospel in our time demands that believers, and priests in particular, ensure that everyone be able to encounter Jesus Christ, made flesh, made man, made history. We must always take care never to lose sight of the flesh of Jesus Christ. That flesh made of passions, emotions, and feelings, words that challenge and console, hands that touch and heal, looks that liberate and encourage, flesh made of hospitality, forgiveness, indignation, courage, fearlessness, and a word, love. Joey, I'm always going to remember an experience I had reading Father Elijah. Yeah. There's a scene in there where, to put it succinctly, he's a priest and he's hearing the confession of a count. And the count opens up to him about his disbelief in God, about how he's lacked faith most of his life, how much he's kind of angry and hates God, right? And Father Elijah's here as a priest, kind of entering into the dialogue, like, why do you hate God? What's your perception of God? What is faith to you? These kinds of things, right? And I remember that scene really gripping me because it was the first time in my life that I actually saw myself as a confessor. It was also the first time in my life that I was actually sensitive, deeply sensitive to the heart of another, opening in the future their hearts up to me.
Yeah.
Right? But because I was in tune with what was happening in the humanity of the count and the humanity of the priest, I remember reading that, and it was very, very moving for me because I felt as if I was talking to the count.
Yeah. And
I felt as if the count was saying something to me. I remember that night, it was during a spiritual retreat. I remember that night praying with that so hard because it was so moving. So I kind of lived this point that he's talking about here. I'm sure you've had similar experiences in your own reading of different literature pieces.
I have. Like one time I was reading the biography of Deacon Max Gallegos, and I was just moved to tears with the mediocrity.
I'm
sorry, that was a good moment, and I just ruined it. And
I think greatness is the word you were looking for. You know. What the crap was that about, dude?
Sorry, dude. I just felt like we had been going pretty hard for a while. We needed a little comedic relief.
Well, I mean, you came in at my expense, I suppose.
Before we transition into our last point from this document, which
I think I'm just gonna leave.
But this is your favorite point, so you have to stay for this
point. Okay, all right. Fine.
And
so I'm staying here for this, not for you, for the people of God, not for you.
Fair enough.
Just making that clear.
Fair enough. The last point that Pope Francis makes is really cool for Deacon Max and I, who are just months away from priesthood ordination. Pope Francis says that there's an intrinsic connection, similarity between a priest and a poet. And the reason for this, he says, is that both the priest and the poet are trying to draw people into an encounter with the word, with the logos.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yes. I think it's important. He brings this idea, like you said, Joey, the priest and the poet, their whole task, and Joseph Pieper talks about this, by the way, in a book called Only the Lover Sings, which is a quote of St. Augustine. That's the point. This book has a section in it that emphasizes this idea, the priest and the poet, the relationship between the two, because they both are able to uniquely bring others into an encounter with the sacred, with the transcendent. Here we would say an encounter with the word, with the logos. Right? In my last 2 or 3 years of thinking about this topic,
this is a big passion. Okay, so background for this conversation. This is why Max stayed for this part of the conversation, is because he loves this topic. He loves talking about how the priest and the artist, the priest and the poet are so similar, and he's always saying it. And he actually, I'm going to give him credit where credit is due. He has a really you've come up with a really powerful insight about why you think that's the case.
Thank you.
So I'm going to give you the chance now. The pedestal, the spotlight is yours.
Would you mind just bowing down just really quickly? That'd be great.
I will not serve.
I will not serve. So the priest and the prophet, how are they similar? Okay, so
the poet.
Oh, priest and the, sorry, I may make that mistake more, but you know what I mean.
You know what he means.
You know what I mean. The priest and the prophet. No, I'm just kidding. The priest and the poet. They're similar in that they are able to organize matter in such a way to bring us again into an encounter with the sacred. They're able to remind us by organizing things in such a way of the word. So, for example, the poet can arrange sentences, right, in order to help us come to an encounter with maybe a deep truth about beauty, for example, right? The priest can do what? He can organize the sanctuary in a very beautiful way to help you encounter what? Well, maybe the preaching of the word, maybe the holy sacrifice of the Mass, right? And so they share in these similar ways.
Yeah.
Okay. But they're distinct because one can intentionally arrange matter to actually not only reflect the sacred, the divine, one can arrange matter in such a way that it actually becomes the word. So the poet, for example, can reflect the goodness, truth, and beauty of Jesus Christ. The priest, however, by divine institution, can arrange matter, bread and wine, in such a way that they actually become the word. The Eucharist actually becomes Jesus Christ. So they both share in similar capacities, but there is an eternal distinction also between the two. And I really found it beautiful when Pope Francis brought this point out, because this is something that we've been living by. And by the way, y'all are seeing it and hearing it unfold before your very eyes. This project is coming about in large part because I've been motivated by this idea. Like as deacons, as future priests, we're using this medium as an art piece to bring you into an encounter with the word.
Yeah.
Right. That's deeply a lot of the motivation behind this insight that I think Pope Francis brings out, that I first encountered in Joseph Pieper, right? That I've encountered in a couple others. So anyways, it's kind of why I'm so passionate about it, because I think it proves to be true in our own lives.
I think it's a beautiful point. The poet brings in people into contact with the word, because Pope Francis actually used this phrase, because when you're reading the words of a poet, you're actually hearing the voice, the capital V voice that speaks through many voices, lowercase v voices. So like words for us Christians are very important. It's why the words, like you said, in the sacrament can transform reality, right? The priest's words of institution transform the body, the bread and wine into the body and blood.
And so his words, but also his intentionality. Notice it's his mind and his heart coming in contact with the way that he expresses that truth before the particular elements that God and the people have ordained to become him.
So words are not indifferent. Just like all things human are not indifferent for us Christians, neither are words indifferent for us Christians.
Or the material world, for that matter.
And I think we can read this last quote from Pope Francis. He says this. He says, "For Christians, the word is God. And all our human words bear traces of an intrinsic longing for God, attending towards that word. It can be said that the truly poetic word participates analogically in the word of God, as the letter to the Hebrews actually clearly states." And he quotes Hebrews 4:12 and 12 verses 12 through 13. And that's the point that you've been telling me for 4 years now. So you're welcome. You win. I mean, not you're welcome. Thank you. You win. And
you're welcome for acknowledging you. No, thanks. Yeah. Well, I mean, and I have to give credit to a priest friend of mine who listens to this sometimes too, who really spurred this idea in me early on in my seminary formation. Should I say his name? I'm not going to say his name. I'll give him credit. Father Torres.
All right,
we're going to have on.
You know who you are.
Yeah. We're going to have him on here soon. And we're going to talk about this very topic, actually, or similar topic. But,
we thought, Deacon Max and I thought that as a fitting way to conclude this episode about why you should read literature is by just recommending a few of the favorite works of literature that we've ever read. So I'll go first and you can go second.
Are you laughing because you don't think I've ever read a book?
I just don't. Yeah, whatever. So some of my favorite pieces of literature: Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens. Love it. The Island of the World by Michael O'Brien. That's the same author that Father Elijah that you just mentioned. Yeah. Michael O'Brien's a great Catholic man. I've never met him, but I assume he's pretty great. He writes good books.
That's not always the case, by the way.
I know. I should be careful. Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis is one of the most mysterious and profound books I've ever read. I've read it twice. I'll definitely read it multiple times throughout the rest of my life, God willing. The Kite Runner. Have you ever read The Kite Runner?
No, I'm not.
It's actually really good.
Is it?
It's so good.
Is it like a guy that runs with a kite?
Yes. How'd you know? You should be a poet.
I mean, you read my biography. the greatness of Deacon Max Heyer.
And then I'm going to say The Power and the Glory too, because I read that during modern literature my senior year of college and it was really good. Oh, and Pride and Prejudice. I know Max was going to make fun of me for that, but
I'm not, because I'm a generous man.
It's a really good book. So those are some of mine that I'd recommend. If you haven't read literature in a while and you're looking to get into a book, pick up one of those. Or Deacon Max has a couple suggestions for us. What are your favorite works of literature?
Actually, The Power and the Glory was one I was going to mention. Another one is Winnie the Pooh. Anything by Winnie the Pooh, Diary of the Wimpy Kids, Goosebumps, anything by Dr. Seuss really just is up there. Really, maybe not the ones that are potentially racist, but outside of that, Dr. Seuss is really
just
up there.
For context. This is why I started laughing before I read my list, is because we were talking about this yesterday, and I was dead serious. Like, we're planning this episode. I was like making the list. I was like, all right, Max, what are your favorite books? And he was like, yeah, one would be Winnie the Pooh, two would be Diary of a Wimpy Kid. And I just friggin' lost it.
Oh, okay. So yes, The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. Screw Tape Letters, I'm going to throw in there too. I mean, C.S. was just
he's
awesome.
a G. Honestly, his space trilogy too is so good.
If you're a nerd, consider reading that. Dante's Divine Comedy, as I've already mentioned, fantastic piece of literature, which Joey's never read because he's not intelligent enough to.
Have you read all three?
Yes, I have.
What's your favorite?
Actually, it's weird, but Inferno. Inferno, just because it's kind of,
so morbid.
It's like it's old school. It's old school piety. That's why I like it, because it puts the fear of hell within me in a way that oftentimes I just don't think about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, this is real. This is scary. And I know what that feels like sometimes. Right. I'm not doing that, kind of thing. Right. So it's kind of an existential experiment almost.
Maybe I'll read that one day. We could do an episode on it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The Divine Comedy is it's a literary depiction of ultimately the Summa Theologia of St. Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, that's right.
He was such a good theologian too. Anyway, sorry, go ahead. Crime and Punishment
by Dostoevsky.
I need to read that.
And then Father Elijah was the last one I could think of. There's several. I mean, we've honestly, Joe, we've read a lot.
We do a lot of reading.
So, but those are some of the ones that came to mind immediately. So
read. Even if, just read. It's better than tonight. You might be planning on going home and watching 2 to 14 episodes of Netflix, depending on your level of self-control. And I would encourage you to maybe just watch one episode and then pick up a book and do some reading.
And we should have said this at the beginning, read good stuff. There's a lot of dangerous stuff to read out there too.
Yeah, I mean, you got to be careful.
You do got to be careful.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing because it can, again, because words are so impactful, because literature carries with it the word, it could also steer you in the wrong direction.
That's true. Yeah.
You got to be careful with what you're reading out there. But in general, do read. I mean, I would say reading almost anything is better than just spending your time on TikTok or whatever all day.
We very rarely give homework on Logos Podcast, but are we doing that right now?
That's right. And submit it next week. Or why don't you just tell us what are some of your favorite books? What are some of your favorite maybe literary pieces, essays? We were talking, arguing.
If there's something, I like to ask this question to people. If you are a reader, what book should I not die without having read? If you have an opinion on that, let me know, please.
That is a strong question. What is yours?
The Bible. No, I'm just kidding. In addition to the Bible, I think The Tale of Two Cities is so good.
Yeah.
If you haven't read that, I think. Have you read that?
No, I'm not actually.
Dude. All right, you get to tell me one book to read this year. I get to tell you one book to read this year. I want you to read Winnie the Pooh. Just kidding. I
already read all of them 40 times.
Tale of Two Cities. You got to read, bro.
Tale of Two Cities.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. Mine is Divine Comedy.
All right, I'll do it. You sold me.
No, he's not.
All right, you guys will see.
You want to show people your ugly banana? That is an ugly banana. right before this, Deacon Joe was like, dude,
probably never play that audio clip out of context.
Please, for the love of God, don't do that. Straight to Joe.
We're going to lose our
right
platform.
away. No, we're not, dude. God is good. He's merciful. He knows we're idiots, and he made us in that way. But Joey made the joke earlier. I was like, dude, that is an ugly looking banana. He goes, dude, I can't wait to eat it in 2 weeks because it's just like an unripened banana. Anyways, well, guys, we hope you enjoyed this kind of comeback episode. We do really appreciate you contributing to our project. Continue to share our stuff, like it. We love you guys, and this project is really taken off, and there's nobody else to attribute it to other than our Lord, and our efforts, I think, with grace. Mm-hmm. So, Joey, those are my last words. Anything from you?
I got nothing, dude. Praying for all our listeners.
That's right. All right, guys, repent, believe in the gospel. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Logos Podcast, and as always, God bless.